Hello, folks. Welcome to Code Swamis. In today's episode, we'll learn about Azure Service Principal. That one question you guys all have: what is a service principal? What are the uses, and how do I create one? Right. Before that, you can have a look at our intro. Now let's talk about service principals. Right. Now, according to Microsoft, a service principal is an identity that is created for use with an application, a script, or any automated solutions. So just like you have user principals to log into the portal, right? When you go to portal.azure.com or portal.office.com, you log in using your user principal name. You have a user principal name and a password. Similar similar type of object, but if it's used by a script or any automated solution, you would have a service principal. These are very similar to your on-prem service accounts. So for this, it is created to be used by any of your Azure resources. Yeah. So access to these resources can be governed by assigning accesses to appropriate roles and permissions, and you can govern this or scope this to your resource. For example, you only want to give your your service principal access to read users. You can govern this using your SPNs or service principals. And it is recommended that if you have any automated solutions, any scripts, any applications, you use one of these service principals to administer them or use to log in, right? User principal names or user principal should be used by users, whereas service principals should be used by automated solutions. Now, there are three types of service principals. We have application-based service principal, your managed identities, and your legacy service principals. Now, an application service principal, it's an instance of an application that's created. So when you go to your portal, which is portal.azure.com, you register an application, your app registration. There is an application created. Also, there will be a service principal, which is an instance of that application, which is created within that tenant. Now, if this application, you want to use this application in different tenant, a new service principal with some attributes of that application would be present in that tenant. Thus, you can have a one-to-one relationship with the software application, and you can have a one-to-many relationship with the corresponding service principal, because you can have multiple service principals for one application, right? So just keep in mind an SPN is created in each tenant where that application is used, and it references that one application object globally. The application object will always be globally unique, whereas you can have multiple SPNs to authenticate or use authenticate that application. A managed identity is something else that can be used. Now, the difference between a managed identity and an SPN is, in a managed identity, you do not, or the developers don't really need to manage any of their credentials. This is taken care of by your managed identity. And when a managed identity is created, then an SPN that's representing that particular managed identity is created in that tenant. Finally, you have the legacy one. Back in the days, I think 2016 or something like that, or even before that, we used to have legacy applications which were created using the old app registration portal. So anything created using that is your legacy application. If you've been using Azure Active Directory and Microsoft services since then, you would know what a legacy application is. However, currently you cannot create one, so you wouldn't really have to worry too much about legacy applications. Pay attention to application type service principals and your managed identities. Now, this is what I was talking to you earlier as well, the user principals and service principals. Now, a user principal would have an interactive login. So you would have a username and you would have a password, right? And you physically enter that. However, SPN would be non-interactive. You can either have a certificate-based authentication, or you could have your password, which is a key, which is generated. Now, one thing about a user principal name, you can log into the portal, right? You can actually go to portal.azure.com, enter your UPN or username and password, or portal.office.com, enter your credentials and log in and view the GUI or graphical interface. With an SPN, you cannot log into the portal and see a GUI or graphical interface. You can only get information using or get, change, modify, do any of the backend stuff using service principals. And thus, it is good if you restrict the use of SPNs to your automated solutions or applications. Now, since you can access the GUI, it is used by, or user principal names are used by users to interact with the portal. And like I told you, it is automated solutions that would use your service principals to access backend data. Now, permissions to a user principal is assigned via admin roles or a custom admin roles if you would like to modify them. But a permission that's assigned to an SPN can be assigned via admin roles, where you can actually give an SPN maybe a user admin role, or you can do it via endpoints as well. So you would give an SPN access to an endpoint. The scope of that endpoint you would set to probably your user.read. So I only want this particular SPN to access users and only be able to read users, not write, not do anything else, just read. Now, for user principal name, I can apply MFA, which is multi-factor authentication. And for a service principal, you cannot access or cannot apply MFA or multi-factor authentication because it's not human, right? It wouldn't be able to access your phone and enter your OTP, or it wouldn't be able to authenticate using a thumbprint. So that's multi-factor authentication. Now, let's learn about creating these service principals. Now, I'll show you how to create a service principal using the portal, since if you're watching this video, it's probably one of the first times you're interacting with service principals, or you're really inquisitive about service principals and really want to get out there and do some automated stuff, right? Now, we look at creating service principals. These are app-based service principals. We'll talk about how we can authenticate against them, how to create these app registrations in the portal. We'll create certificates. We'll generate a key, and we'll show you how you can authenticate, create, and probably manage permissions as well using these service principals. Now, without further ado, we'll pause over here and let me take you to our portal. Yep. So over here we have our portal.azure.com. This is where you would log in if you want to access your portal. You will be logging in using a user principal name. Mine is Clint Oliveira at rapidcircle.com. So you would have your probably your test tenant user principal name and your password. Log in, then click at the left, you would see Active Directory, or you can just search for Azure Active Directory and go to that. Here we would start by creating an app registration. This would be if you're developing an application, you would first start by registering that application, right? So we'll click over here, new registration or new app registration. Now, when you click this button, of course, we'll give it a name, which is unique, and you will get, let's see, what can we name it? We'll name it COPESWMIS hyphen PS APP. Yeah, that should be good, right? So you would first get the option, whereas do you want it for a single tenant, which is just this, or you would want it for multi-tenants, which are other tenants that are out there, right? This third option is, do you want to use it with any multi-tenant and personal Microsoft account? For example, your personal Microsoft accounts would be Outlook.com, your Xbox.com, Skype, and I mean, even if you have a Google account, you can register it with Microsoft, and that would make it a Microsoft account. Or you can have only personal accounts, which are your personal accounts that you have, right? So this particular one, I'll have it as a multi-tenant application. You can also click over here if you want any help in choosing that. This is optional, so I'll leave it there. Let's register this application. So now that this application is or this application is created, there's also a SPN that's created, right? So as is, this application doesn't do anything. It is just created as an object. So think about it as creating a user principal or a user account with access to nothing, right? So that's what this is right now. It is just an object that can be used in the portal. Now, if you want to log in, you need to generate one of these secrets, right? You can either generate a certificate or you can have your client secrets. So this would be like your password. When you create a user account, Microsoft makes sure that you actually create a password. Now, for your service principal, you would have to go here to the certificate tab and generate one of those passwords. Now, there are two types of passwords that can be generated. One is a secret, and one that's a key or a secret, and this is your certificate. We'll look at creating both of these passwords, right? The first one over here is a secret. So when I click on creating a secret, you can give it a description. I'll just write key, and you can set an expiration date. Since this is like your password, right? You can set 6 months should be fine. Click on add. The other type of authentication is a certificate. Now, a certificate should be generated on your system. This would be a self-signed certificate. You'll be generating this on your system. After you generate this certificate, you would have to install it on your system. Once you install it, you would come here and upload the certificate to this particular application or SPN. Now, that proves that you are the person who owns this SPN application and has access to it, right? So let's look at some ways of generating SPNs generating certificates. For that, we'll have to go and use PowerShell, right? Just give me a moment while I get that set up. All right, welcome back. And now let's look at how to generate a self-signed certificate. Now, whenever you generate a self-signed certificate, you have some prerequisites. You will need your tenant name, which is, in my case, spchamp1.onmicrosoft.com. We're on Microsoft.com. That's generated every time that particular term is added to your domain name whenever you create a new tenant. Is known as a Microsoft Online Routing domain. That's what this bit is. Then you would set a path for the certificate. I'll just save this to my temp location. Then my store location is there, and this is my expiration date. I believe in the past we've talked about get date. Get date is something which will give you your date. There we do have a video about that, and we're going to add years one. So this would be for 365 days. Since this is a certificate, it's good to have 365 days, whereas the last one we created was a key, which we kept for 6 months, right? Since it's a password, just like a username and password, that should be rotated or changed every 6 months. But a certificate is a little more secure. This particular type of authentication is what I would recommend people who use or developers who use SPNs to use while they authenticate. Then we'll set some constants here, and then these are some attributes of this certificate. Then we'll create the certificate over here, new hyphen self-signed certificate, and these are the attributes will be added over here. Give it a little bit for this to get created. Now we'll have the path, and now we'll export the certificate to this particular location. Now, if we find the path, it is right here, right? So this is set in my current store. Where is this outputted? Outputted here. So that's in my temp location. Let's go to my temp location and install the certificate on this particular computer. So if I go here, nope, not what I wanted. So let's see. Copy, paste, and temp. Here's my certificate. Double click on the certificate. We'll install the certificate. I'll install it under or for my current user since it's just for me. and this is just for for testing. I'll place this in the personal store. Personal. Okay. Next, and finish. This would install this particular certificate. Import was success. Install and import the certificate on this system. Now, you would need to keep in mind or record this particular string. Now, this is your certificate thumbprint. If I go over here and let's just check this, another place for you to get this thumbprint. Serial here. This is a thumbprint. This is what you actually need. Sorry. So here's a thumbprint. You will need the thumbprint when you want to authenticate. Some things that you need to remember when you are authenticating using a certificate. Notepad. This is the certificate thumbprint, right? So now that I have the certificate, it's a .cer file, right? Let's go back here, and we'll need to upload the certificate to this particular service principal. This proves that I am the person using this SPN, and this SPN is authenticated on this particular system, and this is how I prove that. So let's go to certificate and secrets. Remember the secret that we had right here, right? Now if I come over here to certificate, I click on upload certificate, select the file. Should be in my temp location. Oh, here. There it is. Description, don't need to add one right now, and this uploads this certificate. Yeah, expiration date we've set, if you recall, it was for 1 year, so that it's like auto populated, and you do get a certificate ID, so on so forth. Now we have two types of credentials here. One is your secret and one is your certificate. Now we'll learn how to authenticate using each one of these shortly. Let me see if I refresh, does my password disappear? You won't be able to see this, then you have to generate a new key. Yep, now give me some time and let me set up the bit where we have to log in using either a certificate or key. And welcome back. So let's have a look at how to authenticate using a certificate or a key. The first one we'll talk about is authenticating using a certificate. Now we'll be using two modules over here. Let's say we want to connect to Azure Active Directory. You can connect, or we want to connect the AZ account, and you can connect using this command, right? Just make sure you have these particular modules installed on your system. Otherwise, you will not be able to log in. All right. Now, if you're using Azure Active Directory module, you need a tenant ID. You can get your tenant ID by navigating to the portal, right? You go into Azure Active Directory, and you would see your tenant ID right here. It's in your overview tab. Certificate thumbprint. If you recall, I've told you where to find that certificate thumbprint. Just go to your certificate. So you go to details, and here's your certificate thumbprint, right? You can copy it from here. And lastly, you have your application ID. That's the ID that is generated when you register that application. The application ID can be found in Azure Active Directory, your enterprise applications, and since I just created this application, oh sorry, it's not an enterprise application. You go into app registration. I love clicking on enterprise application. So you go to app registration. Since I created this, it would be under owned application. All applications would be all applications in your tenant, right? So over here, you would click on your application that you just created. Here's your application ID. Application ID, and it's also known as the client ID. Now, since I have this, I would just click here, boom. I am able to authenticate against this tenant. So using this service principal, providing the parameters like using the service principal, which is this application ID, is able to log in using this thumbprint into this tenant. So here, this is just the login bit. If I want to log in using an AZ account, then you can log in using this command, right? Which is connect an AZ account. You get your tenant, thumbprint, and application ID. Give this a little bit, and it should be able to connect. There it is. So over here, we're able to connect or log in to our tenant using a certificate-based authentication, and this is for your SPN into your tenant. Now this uses connect Azure AD module, or it uses the Azure AD module, and this one uses the AZ module. Now give me a moment while we check how to connect using a key. Okay, let's look at how to log in using a key. Right. So over here, you would have your client ID. This is a secret that you have to copy. If you don't copy it, you'll have to generate a new key. Right. And yes, I actually had to generate a new one. So this will specify your tenant domain. So here, these are your login URLs, and the resource we'll be accessing is graph.microsoft.com. So this bit will just log in to the portal. Let's see if we get our auth token. So it gives you this OAuth token. You can use this OAuth token to query a string. So a string that you can query again would specify your parameters, and then you would invoke a REST method to query whatever you're looking for. So the URI over here is for groups, so you could query that particular resource. Now, this summarizes what you can this summarizes what SPNs are, how to log in using SPNs, how to create SPNs, what is probably the right way to do things using SPNs, right? Till here, we've talked about just authenticating to the tenant. Now, you created an SPN, a service principal. You have created your password or your certificate, a way to authenticate, and you are able to log into the tenant. So think about this as a user account that your admin has created with access to nothing really, but you can go ahead and log in. And using the service principal, you are able to log into the tenant. Now, hope this clears a lot of doubts which surround service principles, and yeah, you might have some more doubts as well, which we could cover in our later videos. But in this particular video, it's created to address what service principles are, what you can do with them, how to create them, and how to log in using these service principles. If you found this video helpful, if you found something of value in this video, do hit that like button, share this with your friends, your colleagues, and don't forget to subscribe.